Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and may I say varmt välkommen to the Tuesday session, plenary session today. I need to inform you that we have only 3 presentations today for various private reasons. I would like to, my thoughts and our thoughts go specifically for Ms. Rachinska, who has been unable to join us from the Ukraine. So our thoughts go to her and the Ukrainian people, of course. My name is Jukka Aminov, and I'm here with Professor Kluver and my partner, or my colleague at the national... Sorry. My colleague at the National Federation of Noah's Ark Associations, where we are representing the local board here in Stockholm. Do you want to add anything? We have lots of time today, and probably we'll end this session a little bit earlier for coffee, and you can also look at the posters at the poster session. So we'll have we are very kind today. Would you like to add anything? No. In that case, I will turn to you, Elona. Professor Elona Toska is Associate Professor at the Center of Social Science Research at the University of Cape Town and a Research Associate at the University of Oxford. And your topic today is HIV and early motherhood. Welcome.
Thank you for being here up and early, everyone. I could barely sleep, so I'm very excited to be here. I hope this microphone can catch my voice. That was the most prestigious presentation I've had. I usually say I'm an accidental academic, but hopefully by the end of today, you'll see me more as an activist academic, which is what our team has started speaking and introducing ourselves as. I feel really honored that this topic got a spotlight today, because it's been really growing, and it's actually due to the work of so many people in this room that if I somehow didn't put your name in the bottom of the slides, please don't worry, because I was thinking about everyone I saw yesterday, many of you after 4 years of time remotely, and how incredible it has been to have so many people make focus on HIV and early motherhood. And it's because it is such a complex issue that many of us come at it from different angles. A few disclaimers before I get through the slides. There's a lot of photos on the slides. They're all received with consent through our partnership with UNICEF. There's also some quotes with names. They're all pseudonyms. And there's a lot of presentations. There are a lot of slides on data from our team, particularly at the University of Cape Town and the University of Oxford, from our early career researchers. So I took the liberty of putting their photos, also with consent, on the slides. So just to celebrate all of the work that they've done. My presentation today will have 4 broad areas, some of them a bit shorter than others. So why is motherhood and HIV in adolescence an important topic? Well, for many of us, this is a no-brainer. They have shared risks and vulnerabilities. Both happen when 2 people, at least 2, I'd like to say, are having unprotected sex. So it may not happen exactly at the same time, but they also are, these risks and vulnerabilities are both connected, but they also have shared consequences, sometimes multiplicative, sometimes cumulative. And I thought this is the closest I'll ever be to an iceberg physically. So the visual can really help, because many of us talk about the social and structural drivers of health, but they rarely come together in understanding how these really co-occur in adolescence. UNFPA has a brilliant, beautiful report. In fact, if you want to hear more about the stories of young mothers, please find the 2022 supplement, The Untold Stories of Young Motherhood. But the report never mentions HIV. Now, I understand that for those of us living in the African continent, HIV is a much bigger deal in the context of adolescence than in other areas, in the general population. But it is part of what I want you to think about today is, in your work, how do you go away and bring these 2 areas together, even if it's tangentially? We have strong data that they co-occur. Ali's analysis from 10 countries using DHS data on the left-hand side of the graph shows that there is co-occurrence of HIV and early motherhood in adolescence. This is data from 19,000, nearly 20,000 15 to 19-year-olds. And as you'll see, the HIV prevalence line for adolescent mothers is higher than that for those who are not living with HIV. And there's a lot of other studies, including an oral by Winnie, who I've never met. I'd love to meet you. We've been on many Skype calls together, about the fact that we talk a lot about HIV disclosure, but we also are disclosing and have to disclose motherhood. And if you're thinking about stigma, if those of us who had to learn the root words of the Greek root words of these words, it's about physical markers. And pregnancy and other early motherhood come with a bump, and then with a baby, which is wonderful. But young mothers really experience the physical effects of their bodies changing in the form of stigma. It's happening during a time of immense bodily changes. I don't know how many of you remember being an adolescent. Can I just ask you for 5 seconds to close your eyes and think about your adolescence? Okay, now keep that for the rest of this presentation. There's a lot of change. You're not going to find the one person you're going to spend the rest of your life with. You probably are primarily thinking about, who hates you the most, who loves you the most, what happened to you yesterday, what happened on the walk to school, what are you going to eat. You're not thinking about pregnancy and motherhood. And you certainly are not ready for the hormonal rush that is the body producing another human and the changes that happen with it. On top of that, HIV, whether it's occurring during, before, or after, it's also a massive change on the body. It makes you more likely to get sick. It also makes you have to navigate a lot of these disclosures. And this is an important topic. We don't actually know the timing. With increased access to antiretrovirals, we may actually have a growing cohort of young people and young women who know their status before they become pregnant, but often the diagnosis for both pregnancy, the confirmation of HIV status, and motherhood happens at the same time. And these are no small numbers. Thank you, Wale, for sharing this data with me. It's great to see you in the audience this morning. But the top 2 causes of mortality in 10 to 19-year-olds, adolescent girls and young women are HIV-related complications and obstetric-related complications in young women. And this is really a big deal. There were 21 million pregnancies in 15 to 19-year-olds every year, based on the last UNFPA report. Just over a half are likely to have another child in 2 years, and just under a half were before 17 and unintended and unplanned. Overall, if this were a room of adolescent women in lower and middle income countries, if you look at the person on your left and on your right, one of you would actually have a child. And this is in the context, particularly where we live in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's at least 1.7 million 15 to 24-year-old girls living with HIV. And this really plays out in numbers. This is analysis from the Violence Against Children survey in Lesotho, which is a really magnificent research project, and has 7,100 adolescent girls and young women. When we looked at self-reported rates of sexual risk, these are 5 different measures. I won't go through them one by one, but just focus on the last one, because we all know that sexual relationships are very complicated. If we look at condomless sex in the context of multiple sexual partners, sex with an older partner, and transactional sex, so not just having transactional sex, but actually not using a condom in that setting, adolescent mothers were 40% likely to report having it, compared to 8% amongst those who are not yet mothers, when you're taking into account age and a few other sociodemographic covariates. Now, this isn't to say that now we should all be going around looking at adolescent mothers and going, you're having unsafe sex. It's to acknowledge that, that the factors that got to that unprotected sex that resulted in that pregnancy are still happening in their lives, the social drivers. So if we're not doing something to acknowledge that life wasn't just interrupted and there's suddenly just a mother, or there's suddenly they're only a woman living with HIV, that's really a call for all of us. And this question of a syndemic is a big issue. There's a lot of theories around syndemics, but practically it's about whether there's cumulative or interaction effects. So do things add on to each other and you have 2 bad things and 3 bad things, do you have 5 bad things? Or if you have 2 bad things and 3 bad things, the way that they lay over with each other, you have 10 bad things happening to you. So it has been one of our questions. When we look at two data sets, one from South Africa and one from Lesotho, to the left it's the Hey Baby study combined with some Zanziwako cohort data, 1,700 adolescents, and to the right it's 3,300 adolescents from the Lesotho VAX survey. These are all adolescent girls and young women, and we're looking at 4 groups, each of the points. I won't quiz you on this data, so don't worry, but what you'll notice is that in both graphs the pattern is similar. The red line, which is adolescent girls and young women living with HIV, have higher rates of hormonal contraception use. Great news, but they're both very low. Adolescent mothers, great news, right? They're in the system, they had a child, we got them contraception, but they're extremely low rates. If you'll see, in South Africa, they're about 2/3, 50% for those living with HIV. In Lesotho, they're just around 1/3. But that's not really a syndemic effect. However, when we looked at our South African cohort in the Eastern Cape, this is analysis from Dr. Bolade Banugnu, who did some very fancy tests to test syndemic effect statistically. I can call him on WhatsApp if you have questions about that. He's in South Africa. You can see this graph. And if you focus on the bar on the right, adolescent mothers living with HIV were much more likely to not be enrolled in school. And it isn't just adding the difficulties of the prior 3 groups. There is actually, if you could do an exponential curve in your head, you can see that it's going up. And that is really proven and shown in the data. Dr. Catherine Roberts, sitting in the front here, together with Professor Lorraine Scher and our colleagues Walein Sal and Uma Busakwe at UCT, have really tried to understand how this plays out in the context of mental health experiences. And you'll see a similar graph, additive effects, with young mothers living with HIV having higher rates. And just to plug, Catherine is actually presenting data on the mental health changes pre and during COVID-19 later today. And to the right here, you'll see some of the experiences of young mothers. And I wanted to help you to focus our attention in 2 of these experiences. The first is about the physical stigma that I mentioned earlier. Young women in Mpumalanga in South Africa spoke about having to cover their bodies with blankets of shame because of their pregnancy. And what we noticed is where HIV status, learning and sharing and disclosure came in, and management was a lot around severe experiences of wishing suicidality and mental health, and actually that also got worse during the pandemic. And Catherine's and Lorraine's work again, together with our colleague Bongi, painstakingly collecting child development data using the Mullen-Early scales, shows that these mental health issues of young mothers also have effects on their children. It's a no-brainer, but it is one of the first, and I would say the only, study that we've able actually to quantify. And it's particularly self-reported symptoms of PTSD, which we know are very closely linked to experiences of violence, which many of you in the audience have focused on studying. But what about health service access? I won't actually read all of the statistics, but I wanted to just shed a light on some of these experiences of young mothers living with HIV specifically. 99% of them had an unintended pregnancy. I like to remind myself that it doesn't mean that their children were not wanted or loved. They were just not ready to have a child. And if you remember those rates of contraception earlier, they're probably not ready to have another child. So what are we doing to support them to be ready to time their next safer pregnancy? Low rates of antenatal care coverage, and because they're young mothers, only 1/3 knew their status before pregnancy, likely because they had acquired it vertically. And then some data on the children in purple, and a lot of them are focusing on HIV-specific outcomes. 8% of the mothers already knew they had a child living with HIV. For those of us who know the data from South Africa, that's much higher than the national MTCT rate. And when we're looking at broader access to health services, Kamel Witteseel, doctor to be soon, is looking at access to vaccination, and just under half had full vaccination at 1 year old. There was a slight variation by HIV status, but we're trying to understand that. We had to exclude actually hepatitis B vaccination due to stockouts. And very briefly about the effect of COVID. Many of us here have seen this happening in our work, in our research. It stopped a lot of research. In our team, we had to pivot entirely and do everything on the phone. So this affected a little bit the data. But South African data from live hospital births documented a huge increase in very early mothers, so 49% in 10 to 14-year-old mothers. This has been documented in other countries, but this strong data from live hospital births is from South Africa specifically. Nontokozo Langwenya, who I haven't spotted today, is presenting later on the effect of violence, including IPV and HIV status, pre and during COVID-19 from these phone calls. We have strong data on food insecurity, the work of Dr. Leslie Gittings, and mental health, Catherine later. We also know that there was limited health service access and stockouts. Eswatini went for a year without contraception, and I'm sure they weren't the only country. Colleagues were just generous to share these challenges with us. And of course, one of the platforms that young people access services, schooling, were also disrupted, so they couldn't get access to school meals and other support. I cry whenever I read this, so does most of our team, so I chose the least painful quotes for this slide. We'd had some really profound experiences with adolescent parents unintentionally during COVID-19. And I just wanted to highlight that, and Jenny, your talk this morning about transitions was, I don't know if you're in the audience, was really powerful. There's a lot of changes happening. Pregnancy is a really big transition, but then there's also very unique experiences during the birthing process. So to the left here, it's just an experience of a young mother living with HIV, giving birth during COVID. This was after, I think, over 24 hours without food and drinks and no blankets at the hospital. And it wasn't just the birth that was difficult, and we don't know exactly why it was hard. It could be COVID-19, it could be stigma, it could be power dynamics that we know exist in all access to healthcare facilities. She was alone the entire time. But this also really was difficult post-birth. There was a lot of judgment about how she was taking care of herself and her baby. And when she got an infection, not as bad as to cause, she's well now, but she was asked to just clean up better by the doctor. And this wasn't really hard just for young mothers. We've actually, we've been really privileged to also hear the stories of young fathers. And this is from a paper that was already published, but Dr. Leslie Gittings is actually working on a deeper kind of case story. And this is a sentence from a father, but everyone had to hustle. And actually what adolescent also is a time of intense hustling. That experimentation that makes you have unprotected sex also makes you do things that you'll never do as a 17-year-old with 23 years of experience. Because I know how wrong it can go. But young fathers were trying to find nappies. They were asking neighbors for milk for the baby. They were wearing masks and buying them with money that they didn't necessarily know where to find, isolating themselves. And Lorraine has often said we should not forget the young fathers. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But finally, it's not all doom and gloom. Many of you sitting here are doing incredible work to support young mothers. And it really recognizes that young mothers are at the center of a constellation. I wrote a whole grant proposal about the mother-child dyad, and I thought I was being incredibly novel by saying I should include the caregiver in this. And this was before this work started, so I'd like to say I've learned a lot. But it's not just about the physical connections. During COVID-19, our young people were drawing into really strong faith and belief systems that was really keeping them going as they were hustling. They had complicated yet wonderful relationships, sometimes with their caregivers, but then the fathers of their children who were not always their sexual and romantic partners. Because adolescence is a time of change. You may not want to be in a relationship with the person you had sex with at 16, and that is okay, I think. So what else can we do? Dr. William Rudgard at the top over there and Lucy did some analysis and collaboration with the World Food Programme, and this is a brief that you can find about how we can implement some of this data that Dr. Mona Ibrahim sitting in the audience led. And what they found is that access to food security in the last week was associated with reductions in 5 of the 7 outcomes that were tested. I won't read them one at a time, but if you're sitting there going, yes, Elona, you need food, I agree. So when we're thinking about preventing or timing future pregnancies and our HIV response, let's remember that young people do wake up thinking about being hungry and not having food before they think about condoms or PrEP. Also a no-brainer, but it's really powerful to have the data. I don't know how many of you here have looked after a child for more than 6 hours, so not a fun auntie or uncle? No? Oh, lots of hands, good. I know many of you are just trying to escape from that responsibility. But childcare is critical, and we all know it's critical to us being here, it's critical to a lot of us doing the powerful work that we do, and it is critical for young mothers. So when they're hiding at home with their blankets of shame, it's really important to think about how we're supporting them to access childcare, because it's not just great for their education. You'll see at the top, it's really brilliant for their aspirations. It's also good for their child development on the top left, and it's also good for their ability to be a parent. And this is analysis by Dr. Janina Joachim and Lucy here. And a plug for some data on that is being presented later by our colleague Janke. We try to then understand what makes a difference to accessing contraception, because 99% of these young women are leaving the birthing ward with contraception in their body. 99%. Do you remember those graphs, how low that was when we talked to them? So something is happening. Janke will present on it. But it really is about treating young people kindly and offering them choices. So we're extremely lucky. We're not just doing research, we're also trying to implement it. Like many of you in the room, we have a strong collaboration with the Department of Basic Education in South Africa, which has an incredible visionary policy to support young mothers to return to school, to support their school progression, and to prevent HIV and future pregnancies. And there are 4 components that were really linked to reaching these 3 goals. It's keeping young mothers in school as long as possible and safe during pregnancy, access to childcare, having confident young mothers, and youth-friendly services. And youth-friendly services made a difference also for HIV-related outcomes. This was not, when we asked young people to draw dream clinics in South Africa, some of them drew Beyonce waiting for them at the door, or a fridge with cool drinks. I would also like those when I go see the doctor. But actually, when we tested quantitatively what made the biggest difference, it was 2 factors. Being able to go to the facility safely and affordably, and not feeling shouted at. Now, all of my work in HIV and adolescence started because a pediatric head at a facility in the Eastern Cape said, there's these young mothers coming in and just passing HIV on to their children. When I heard it, I felt very told off because I was working with adolescents living with HIV. So I went back to our sample and we could only find 13 of them. So we thought, where are the mothers living with HIV? And many of them are really struggling and not actually staying in care after giving birth. But as you can see here, these are already women who have children. There's really improvements when we're able to provide them with respectful care and help them access care at low cost. I'm wrapping up. I know that I saw the green flag. But I really wanted to highlight some really wonderful programs, and particularly Nicola couldn't be here today from Jandiri in Zimbabwe. They've had an incredible program with the cats for years, but they've actually recently focused on young mentor moms. And this is a cascade of data that she shared by email, so it's not peer-reviewed. But I don't know that it needs a lot of scrutiny because the numbers speak for themselves. The early infant diagnosis is at 92% compared to the 72% nationally, and their MTCT rate is 1% compared to 8% nationally in Zimbabwe. Some colleagues have spoken about the importance of U equals U. When we shared this with young people at the PATA Summit, Lou, I'm not sure when it was, pre-COVID, someone said, but how do I know I am U equals U? And that's a big question. It's an incredibly powerful tool, but we don't necessarily have full access to viral testing regularly for everyone. So the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, Committee for African Youth Advisors, put together a series of cartoons to help facilitate difficult conversations around U equals U, including with your sexual partners and also with if you find out you're pregnant. And to close up, there's a lot more programs than that. Our team has been thinking about maternal mental health and developed the Ask, Boost, Connect debrief, I think we've called the D now, focused on a first aid responder mental health kind of model. And if you have questions, please ask Christina, who's in the audience. But there's a lot of programs happening, some of them focusing on HIV and some of those not. So to wrap up, what can we do? When you're thinking about HIV prevention, how are you taking early motherhood or the risk of it into account? When we're thinking about contraception, how do we frame it so that people don't run away from the biomedical solution? One option is to think about safeguarding fertility. So the idea that you're safer when you can choose when you have children. And lastly, what about this endemic of living with HIV and being pregnant or having just given birth or being a mother living with HIV? What is the extra support that that requires? And lastly, everyone who we see in our care, clinical, etc., they're really complex humans, but young people are extra complex and they're wonderful. So this is, and when they have children, they love them and they're fun, and when they're silly and break their glasses, they also giggle and have fun. So these are two quotes, one at the top from an adolescent father or a young father, and at the bottom, one about the dreams of a young mother in South Africa. Thank you for listening and for the extra time. I'd like to thank everyone.
Thank you, Professor Toska. As we're not that short of time today, just a brief question. Is there anything you would like to add to your presentation, specifically on the subject of early motherhood from an HIV-specific perspective?
I think that we're missing a lot of opportunities in integrating our services. I know that's been our motto for a very long time, but if you have a young woman sitting in front of you who's pregnant and who's, for example, tested positive, we actually have several protocols in place. But if they're testing negative, we're not always linking them to all of the services that they need. And if you think about the fact that they may have heightened vulnerabilities, we maybe want to think about it a little bit differently. And in countries where age of consent does not allow to do some of these services, because the reason we have done some of this work is because we've worked very hard to work with young women under 18. It's very difficult to have to do research with this group, and our team is incredible and it's taken a huge investment. Most of the time people just say we're not sure about the data from under 18-year-olds. So what we've tried to do is just provide some of that data. And when that's not possible, to think about other entry points. Their husbands, for example, in the case of Cameroon, where we're working, where age of consent is 21. So maybe working through husbands to access their younger mothers, their wives if they're younger. So if a man is getting initiated on antiretrovirals, to think about what's happening to their wife, especially if they're younger, for example. And to just come at it from a point of compassion and care. And they're going through life with a lot of courage. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am delighted to introduce our next plenary speaker. I first met Alastair about 10 years ago in South Africa when he was a young hotshot. And now he is a well-established and very senior hotshot. He's the research director of the Centre for Community-Based Research at the Human Sciences Research Council and also an honorary associate professor in clinical medicine at Wits University. He's going to be talking today about digital technologies, and Alastair really is a world leader in this field, so it's very exciting to have him here.
Morning, everyone. Do you guys want to get in? I mean, if people want to move inwards, then you all don't have to stand. Could I ask a few people just to shift in a little bit so that everyone can get a seat? Thank you.
Great idea.
Pleasure. Great. Thank you so much. I know it's not pleasant to give up your seat, but I appreciate it that you did. It's really my great privilege to be talking to friends and colleagues today about a topic that's dear to my heart and particularly exciting at this moment in time. I basically had to rewrite my talk because the last 6 months have changed the world so dramatically that I felt I'd be doing a disservice to you all if I didn't speak about what might be the most important opportunity that's faced humanity since we became bipedal. Let's start with a story. Just in Gamlistan, there is this small statue of what's known as the boy staring at the moon, or the Iron Boy. My guide, who was very funny, if you have any spare time, I recommend going and doing this tour, but he was describing how a young couple who were childless had yearned for the joy of having a young child. And so the son or the father had gone to the furnace, taken iron ore, and crafted in those hot flames a child that came out as this iron boy. He was strong and he was a real asset to the village, but through time the iron started to rust and eventually the child disappeared back into dust. For a long time, I think people have had this myth that we want to take the inanimate and make it animate. And what's very exciting about this moment is that we are at a point where these ancient dreams are literally about to become a reality. It's no more just, it may sound a little bit like I'm using hyperbole, but we are actually very close to a place where the idea of us being the only species that have cognitive abilities on this planet is about to end. And so this talk will hopefully just bring some of the literature in this space to this group so that we can all, with our skills as behavioral and clinical scientists, bring our minds to this very, very important moment. So it all started in 2017 with some scholars working at Google Deep Brain. They basically came up with the idea of a new architecture for working with neural networks. The paper, these are papers that have been published, the highest cited papers of all time. That's not mine there with 300,000 citations. But the paper on the transformer has moved in the last 6 years to become the fourth most cited paper of all time, displacing a biomedical DNA sequencing lab assay that was sitting in that place. That paper was published in 1960. So what that paper took 60 years to do, this paper has done in the last 6. And why it is so revolutionary is that it has brought a unified the fields of computer science into a single architecture that allows all of these disciplines to rapidly increment and accelerate their learning based on the work that each other are doing. So robotics doesn't sit on its own anymore with computer vision on its own. These fields all have recognized that in some ways they are all dealing with information. If you think of an image, it's just a long sequence of pixels. If you think of words, they are a long sequence of words. Our DNA is a long sequence of information encoding our existence. And so the transformer has taken this concept of information and turned it into an approach where you throw large amounts of data and large amounts of compute to generate a neural network that has, in many ways, exceeded what people thought might be possible in this space. To try and represent, so this is an example of how these transformers work. Some of you may have read in The Guardian and all over the place about tools like ChatGPT. I really want to encourage you to stretch your mind again. I think a lot of us have heard of these tools and thought, oh yeah, that's a fun toy, I can make it write a poem about peanut butter. That's not what we're talking about, and the opportunity is much larger than that. So please bear with me and reopen your minds to the possibility that this is not just an advanced autocomplete that we're working with here. These tools are both an opportunity and extremely dangerous at the same time. To help visualize just what the speed of progress has resulted from some of these breakthroughs, this is a common, very popular platform called Midjourney. So this is a prompt where you take a text string and it transcribes that text string into an image. In 2022, the first version of Midjourney came out, and this is the image of an incredibly detailed close-up of a shot of Tom Holland. This is April 2022. This is last year, July 2022, November, March, and just the other 2 months ago, this is where the model sits now. So that is 1 year of progress. And I think that what is interesting about this is that there's no signs at this point of things slowing down. I think everybody is aware of deep fakes and all the complexities around that, but again, I think it's too shallow to think about these technologies just in terms of their impact on media. But video is already very much a possibility. So we've moved already from images to creating video. There are multimodal models that will take video and turn it into sound, or you give it a picture of a bird and it'll give you the song that the bird sings. There's just an explosion. I did so many of these versions of this because each week I had to add new data to this presentation. Just to kind of try and convince you all that this isn't just, as I say, a stochastic parrot or something that just you might have read. And this is true in training. What the model does is learn the next word. But when we come to time of inference, so when we then ask the model to complete a prompt for us, the truth is nobody yet knows how those large neural networks with 100, 200, a trillion parameters, or if you think of them as neurons, how they actually work. And one of the things that I hope to convince you about is theory of mind. So for those of you who are not sure what theory of mind is, it's quite fun. In some ways, it's our ability to understand the world from another person's perspective. And I missed the animation, but you might have seen there was popcorn under that lid, and then you may have seen the popcorn disappear and a bowl of fruit was put on. So this is an example of the kind of test that was given to the language model, where you would say, Alastair came into the room and he saw the popcorn, a lid was put on the popcorn, and I went out to the kitchen. And then my colleague Hilton came in, ate the popcorn, and put a bowl of fruit under the lid. So when I come back in the room, what do you think I think is under the lid? The popcorn. That's theory of mind. So in 2019, the models were showing theory of mind of about a 2-month-old, so nothing. 2020, this, through testing, was predicted to be around the theory of mind of a young child of 3 years old. 2021, of a 7-year-old child. 2022, a 9-year-old child. And last month, the paper came out, which has now shown that we have achieved levels with a few-shot prompting of theory of mind of an adult. Do you know what is most interesting about this to me is that nobody knew this existed until about a year ago. So these models were developing theory of mind without us knowing that that existed yet in the model. And so I think that that is really interesting, this field of emergence. And that is that as you add more neurons, more parameters to these models, they start to exhibit features that were not programmed into them and that we don't yet know and fully understand how it works. You see arithmetic models beginning to add and subtract and multiply, question answering, translation, all emerge without them being specifically programmed into the original code and into the original training set. It's quite a profound moment if you think about it. We don't know why this is happening. And if you think of, in the media, again, there's a lot of talk about slowing down, 6-month ban, talking at Congress. Part of the reason is these emergent properties, where we don't yet know what all models can do. And once connected to the internet, there's some basic rules that people put in place. If people have thought long and hard about this before it arrived, one of the keys was don't put it on the internet. Well, of course we have. And so now models like this have access to the internet. And it's not yet clear just what other abilities exist that we don't know about. I think it's best. So this is the one side. You get another side of the argument if you go online. There are a lot of people, if you read in the literature as well, people who are saying this is simply, the theory of mind is simply a training issue. It's been the fact that it's seen all this data before, it's able to recall some of the tests that it's seen, maybe some of the theory of mind tests that psychologists use online and was part of the training set, and so it's just regurgitating what it knows. So we don't, I think that this quote, that's why I put it up, is probably quite useful right now, is that although there are dozens of examples of emergent abilities, there's few compelling explanations for why such abilities exist. It's my last general slide, and then I'll get into some of why I think this is important for us as a field. this wasn't my idea, but the historian Harari, I forget his name right now. There we go, Yuval. I think really much more succinctly than I could, described how we have come to the point of the end of human history, and that we are entering a period now simply of history. We no longer know what we read, what we hear, what we see, whether it was created by humans or by artificial intelligence. For in fact, you don't even know whether this talk I'm giving was written by me or by AI. Yes, it was not written by me. The other part that's interesting is that our culture, from our banks to our synagogues and temples, are all controlled by language. And by training machines in language, we've handed over the key to our culture and our society to machines. And this has kind of got profound implications in that for up until now, we've been responsible for creating our identities, our behaviors, our thinking about the world. But from this point forward, there are going to be both human as well as artificial intelligence-related ideas about society. And so we've unlocked, and there's no stopping. And so I think that's why I wanted to speak a little bit with you all about what we can do as a collective to try and harness this opportunity and not just ignore it. Remember that band I was telling you about, like our brain, the rubber band of our brain. I don't want this talk to end and everybody to, oh, that was fun, let's go back to normal. The world is not normal, unfortunately. And so although we may focus very heavily on our worlds and on these fields that we focus on, I think it's important that you just recognize what's happening alongside us at the moment. So how does this impact the future of our work as behavioral scientists in the world of HIV? I think one of the key, so this is probably the key takeaway I want to leave with you. It's very important, and that is that up until now, the way that technology has functioned is to optimize for attention. What all the big companies have done is to try and get eyeballs onto their app, whether that's Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. Everything is about optimizing for attention, getting you to spend time looking. That era is done and has been replaced with an era where we will be optimizing for intimacy. That is, the time is just about upon us where, rather than attention, these companies and models are going to be looking to form bonds with us. It will know your exact likes, your dislikes, the things that you aspire towards. One of the biggest growing websites online at the moment is something called Character AI. I don't know if any of you have played with it. But you can create an AI in the likelihood of something that you would like to engage with. And people spend hours talking to these agents. I think what's also kind of interesting is if you think about that combined with some of the image work, you can imagine people forming sort of romantic relationships as well. So these are just some quick images that are totally AI generated. These are not real people. And so if you take language models and this growth in people's interest in porn, there's a real opportunity here that people are going to, we don't know. And that's why I think I opened this as a research question for the field. There's working in sexual reproductive health. What does it mean that we are going to be soon dealing with people forming these kinds of intimate relationships with machines? So that's point one. Point two, let's look quickly. I just want to quickly speak about the medical profession. So this is the United States Medical Entrance Exam. 2020, some of the early gender pre-trained models not doing so well on that test. Just quickly shooting through here. I think you see the trend. And this last point just arrived a couple of weeks ago out of Google. They kind of got scared by what OpenAI were doing and released MedPalm 2. It's scoring at a pass rate on the medical board exam, not quite at the level of human doctors, but very, very proficient in answering medical questions. I think what's more interesting for us in this room is not how well they are able to regurgitate that knowledge, but this paper, 1,000-odd physicians were asked to rate the answers of doctors or chat models in a pairwise comparison. They weren't told which was which, but you can see here I don't know if this is surprising to you, but it was to me, that clinicians preferred the AI answers almost in every category over the physician's answers. And so this is an open research question. What does this mean? At the moment, I think one of the core pieces is that trust remains with humans. You wouldn't go to a doctor, have the AI make a diagnosis, and then that be it. I wrote a paper recently on the use of these models in care of sort of lay counseling situations. And a really good reviewer comment was, well, who's responsible? If the AI gives that person some mental health advice that's poor, who's responsible? It's a bit like with self-driving cars. If they have an accident, if there's no driver driving the car, who's responsible? And I think this is another core research question. I imagine a world soon where you won't have clinicians making decisions that are legal without having consulted some kind of AI as well. But where that trust lives is a question that we could all be exploring. So if you think that's the worst part or the best part, I've only just got started. Things are moving well beyond what I've just described. That's the last 5 months, the last month. We're starting to see the arrival of autonomous agents. So what this is rather than humans prompting these models, programmers have gone ahead and allowed these models to enter into an infinite loop where they prompt themselves. So you would give it a task, please write me a PowerPoint presentation, you say go, and it will then start thinking, well, what tasks do I need to complete in order to make a PowerPoint presentation? I need to look online for resources, I need to think about pictures, and it will continue then to iterate until it reaches its conclusion. Next, rather than one autonomous agent, somebody had the great idea of what if we have a group of them talking to each other? And so there was some work out of Stanford not long ago. You may have, it sort of made the mainstream media news. You may have heard about it. But 20 AIs were put into a virtual village, a bit like The Sims, and given goals and tasks. And interestingly, they started to form very complex social patterns with each other. And I'll give you an example of this shortly, but the idea of multiple agents, imagine for yourself, you had 5 agents, one that's really good at maths, one that's good at legal studies, one's good at ethics, one's good at psychology, one's good at medicine. Imagine they were talking all the time about your life and your data as your step count goes to that group, and they are kind of thinking about what advice they can give you to optimize your life. And then I think the biggest and most interesting is that people have now also begun generating agents that are self-improving. So these agents write code that is then incorporated back into their own model, which allows them to say, for example, okay, I don't know how to make a PowerPoint. Let me go and read online about how PowerPoint code works, and I'll write a module that allows me to make PowerPoints. And so the self-improving agents are now just on our doorstep and will be entering our world quite soon. This is an example, just to not try and keep it not too theoretical, that I created for this presentation. Apologies to the statisticians in the room, but I was thinking, I always struggle with power calculations and sample size. So made 3 agents, a methodologist, statistician, and a sort of principal investigator, and I asked them to help me think through how I'd make a randomized controlled trial of the impact of community-based HIV prevention in young adolescents. And this is them now starting to talk to each other. You can see, hi Blessing, let's solve this problem together. Blessing says, sure, Zuki, happy to work with you on this. And the supervisor's happy so far. So Zuki is now responding, that's happy with the formulation. They feel like they don't have enough information, so they want to check in with me again. So they come back with me asking some questions. I've given data back just for brevity. I've cut some of this out. But you can see that the supervisor said, you've made some mistakes in your thinking, and we need to go back and change the way that we formulate this problem, including inter-class correlation. So this is just a quick example of what I mean when I say a society of minds or agents talking with each other to come to some kind of conclusion. I'm almost done. I have 2 slides left. So I think to leave you with what's not clear to me is, are we about to enter another, what they call AI winter? Are we at the top of this graph, or are we at the beginning? And so one thing that is important at this point is that in our history, we've never actually made tools that are able to improve themselves. And so in the past, we've always had to rely on our own intelligence to be able to continue to make improvements. What we've unleashed now is the possibility that it won't just be ourselves, but also the agents that we've created that are going to help continue to drive innovation and change. I want to thank my funders, and if you are interested, I thought you might enjoy talking to this autonomous agent that I created for you all that has access to all the papers that I've referenced. And so you would be able to talk with the papers, ask a question about emergence, you're able to ask it questions about society of minds, and you should have a nice chat with the papers. Now you don't have to read them anymore. The hard work is done. If the QR code doesn't scan, this technique came out 2 or 3 days ago, and I thought it looked cool, so I wanted to try and make my own QR code using Stable Diffusion. There's the link underneath. Oh, that's amazing. Technology never works. So. A big thanks to my colleagues who make my life so much, I really enjoy my work, and largely because of my amazing colleagues, some who are in this room, some who I've left behind in South Africa. But I hope that you've enjoyed this talk, and I hope that this doesn't leave your minds, and that you please continue to consider this topic and think about how we could work as a group to make sure that particularly these relationships that start being formed with machines is understood in an ethical way. What are the consequences of doing what's coming? And let's not leave it to Google and OpenAI and Microsoft just to put all this stuff on us without the correct thinking. So thank you very much.
We have time for one question.
Thank you. Yes, the risks are another talk. And so I thought I would keep on the more opportunity. But clearly, as you will all know from the media, the risks are probably not the sci-fi risks that we see. It's not about Terminator. But for me, I think it's more the possible risk is about the corrosion of our society into something that's no longer defined just by where humanity wants to take culture. There are risks also, obviously, in elections. I think the next American elections are going to be particularly, it may no longer be possible to hold elections because of the disinformation that's possible. You can imagine on the social media platforms that you exist, one of these agents are trained on your demographics and kind of a profile of the things you like and starts to talk to you in a way that is exactly what you want to hear. And so I think that's a danger. The other danger is probably the people that are leveraging these tools. I think one of the arguments that got made against the ban was, well, okay, the US stops, but what does that mean, depending on which side of this fence you are? What happens if China doesn't, or what happens if Australia doesn't stop? And so bad actors are already working on these technologies, I am 100% sure. The risk is, I think, more about how we as humans use this new tool versus necessarily the tool on its own going rogue.
We've got one more question. Shall we take?
It's a live stream.
Thank you for really interesting, thought-provoking talk. You mentioned not leaving this to the Google and Microsoft engineers and companies. How about collaborating with them?
Thank you. A really good question. About 2 years ago, we held a workshop funded through the NHIR on how early childhood was going to be impacted by these technologies. It's called Hacking the Future of Childhood. And the only people we couldn't get to attend were industry, which was really interesting. Eventually, what did happen is that we were invited to collaborate with Google's Moonshot Lab, the Google X, around some of this. And I think there is what's happened is a lot of scientists have moved into the companies because of the costs of training these models. And so I agree. I think there has to be some collaboration. We can't do this on our own. It was sort of what we were saying in the mHealth session yesterday as well. Academia can't build mHealth tools that don't fit into the ecosystem of where the world expects apps to now be. Thank you.
So, do you hear me? Good. So exciting with all this news. And now we have the last speaker, and it's Rosemary Delabre from New Jersey, living in Paris. So I say bienvenue à Stockholm. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So I would first like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak today about community-based PrEP research among women. So I'm going to start by what we know. We know that specific groups of women are disproportionately affected by HIV, and this is largely driven by gender inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, and stigma and discrimination, which also affects their access to prevention and treatment services. So we also know that oral pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, is effective when it is taken as prescribed. Early oral PrEP studies among women showed lower protection. However, this was largely attributed to poor adherence. However, a recent pool analysis based on real-world data presented at this year's CROI showed that the effectiveness of FTDF for PrEP among cisgender women was comparable to that among cisgender MSM when adherence was high. However, this analysis also showed that overall adherence decreased over time. Adherence issues were also found in a PrEP study conducted among transgender women in Brazil. However, we note in this study that despite poor adherence, retention was high at 48 weeks, up to 85%. And this was largely attributed to the fact that transgender women were implicated in the development and implementation of the study, as well as the fact that the project provided gender-affirming care. Oops. Oh, sorry. So while we must acknowledge that there are issues regarding adherence in the research on PrEP among women, what I want you to think about today is thinking beyond these issues of adherence and thinking, is there something else that we're missing regarding implementation of PrEP among women? So this map shows the cumulative PrEP initiations by country. It's dated from May. And while PrEP initiations have been increasing over the years, we have an issue of visibility in terms of real-world data among PrEP among women. Based on the data that we have, we can see, for example, that in the United States, PrEP coverage among women is lower than among men. And then in France, women make up only 4% of PrEP users compared to 96% among men. In data that's available in South Africa, we see that among over 2,000 PrEP initiations between 2016 and 2020, only 1,258 were still actively in the court. So active female sex workers were still actively on PrEP in 2020. So we know that women are exposed to PrEP, and we know that PrEP works, but uptake is low. So let's consider interest. Earlier studies of PrEP, oral PrEP, showed low awareness and knowledge of PrEP among women. But once women learned of the PrEP, they expressed interest. And this is particularly true for women who have experienced intimate partner violence, violence from clients, and also women who have HIV exposures, such as women who share injection drug equipment. And we also see that women who feel at risk are also interested in PrEP. So basically, we can see that women who have exposures to HIV and who feel exposed are interested in PrEP. So again, what explains this lack of uptake and adherence? And to answer this question, I think it's important to take a broader view, much as we do when we consider exposure to HIV. When we think about barriers to PrEP uptake, we need to take into account the multiple levels that impact the health of the individual and influence their access to uptake of prevention tools. And although this is not in any way exhaustive, we can see that the various barriers that have been documented in the research show that uptake and retention, there are various barriers that affect uptake and retention amongst women. And consequently, it's important to implement actions that address these multiple barriers. So now I'm going to present 3 community-based projects that aim to implement innovative actions to overcome specific barriers to PrEP among women. So firstly, I'd like to present the NRS Princess study, which was presented yesterday during the PrEP session. This is an interventional cohort of female sex workers in San Pedro, Ivory Coast. This study aimed to implement and evaluate a community-based comprehensive reproductive health package for female sex workers, which included PrEP. This project was developed in collaboration with APROSAM, a community-based organization that provides HIV prevention and testing. And within the framework of this project, the testing, these activities were available through a mobile clinic and their community clinic. So looking at the data that was presented yesterday, we can see that PrEP interest was very high among the women involved in the cohort. However, 57% exited the cohort before initiating PrEP, and 64% who initiated PrEP did not return for their first follow-up visit. And so what can we learn from this experience? From the data that you can see here, it shows that this offer was perhaps not well adapted to this female sex workers who have high mobility. So we really need to think about interventions that better meet their needs. And specifically to address perhaps the fact that the PrEP uptake and follow-up of the PrEP needs to be more simplified for this population, for example. The next project is Programme PrEP Femmes, which my disclaimer is that I am involved in this study. This program is a community-based program implemented in Morocco, Mali, and Mauritius by Coalition Plus member organizations LCS in Morocco, Arcade Santé Plus in Mali, and PILS in Mauritius. This program aimed to develop and implement a sustainable, tailor-made strategy using the community-based approach for deploying PrEP by integrating it into a range of combination prevention tools provided by the participating community-based organizations. This study is focused on female sex workers in Morocco and Mali, and transgender women and partners of people who inject drugs in Mauritius. So it's important to take into consideration the context of PrEP at the start of this program. So in Mali, PrEP was available to MSM through the Co-MSM PrEP project, but it was not available to any other key populations. In Mauritius, PrEP was available in structures in the Ministry of Health since 2018. However, there was really no communication on PrEP, and only 1% of PrEP users were women. And in Morocco, following a demonstration project, PrEP was provided through community-based services at the LCS. However, they noted that retention was low among sex workers. Oops. So the strength of the PrEP Femme program is built on the 3 main pillars that you can see here, as well as the community-based approach. So regarding research, we produced scientific data within each of the 3 countries, which is used to develop a PrEP deployment strategy that is adapted to the target populations and to the country context. This research data also feeds into the advocacy plan to help create an environment a political and health environment that's more favorable to PrEP uptake. Oops. And finally, based on the research and the advocacy efforts, an intervention to create or reinforce the existing PrEP-based, community-based program is put into place at each of the 3 participating community-based organizations. And within the framework of this project, 4 community advisory committees were developed and follow the program throughout the duration. So thanks to the research phase, we collected data, qualitative and quantitative data on the barriers, and we were able to identify the barriers that you can see here. So barriers were identified at the individual, structural, organizational levels, and we also identified barriers regarding the drug itself. So I won't go into detail on the barriers here because I want to focus on what was done following the identification of these barriers. So for example, in Morocco, they chose to implement something that would target the stigmatization that was seen among sex workers and also the need to increase awareness of PrEP. This was done by a workshop that was conducted with the sex workers and community coordinators. And this also led to a play that was put into place. And the play has been presented 3 times at 3 different populations, even touching the general population. In Mali, they put into place a training that was targeted towards journalists. This training was conducted over 2 days and reached 28 people. And the training was organized to increase knowledge of HIV and combination prevention, to increase awareness of PrEP, as well as to deconstruct perceptions of key populations. And following this training, we can see that in the media coverage, that PrEP was spoken about without discriminatory language, and that the media coverage conveyed an understanding of the vulnerability of female sex workers. In Mauritius, the advocacy efforts were geared to getting PrEP out of the Ministry of Health structures. So a collaboration with the Ministry of Health for a national campaign, a communication campaign on PrEP, eventually led to authorization of PrEP being available in community-based centers. At Pils, they actually opened a community clinic where they now provide PrEP for women within this project. And recently in March in 2023 of this year, they've now implemented a mobile service for PrEP, which is geared towards certain populations, specifically transgender women who reported very important barriers to accessing medical services due to stigma and discrimination. So we are now in the last phase of this project. The community-based organizations are now implementing PrEP, and we're looking forward to the data, which hopefully will be available by the end of the year. So as you can see, these first 2 projects have really emphasized integration of PrEP in existing services. And this is also possible and has been done, for example, in the harm reduction setting. So this project that I'll speak about here is a multi-phase formative research study using mixed methods. They use a community participatory approach with the collaboration between Johns Hopkins and the Charm City Care Connection, a community-based harm reduction organization based in Baltimore. The project aimed to improve uptake of PrEP among people who inject drugs and women. It was for women who inject drugs, but I think that they opened the project to all genders. And following a formative phase, they decided to implement, to design an intervention to a PrEP promotion program among frontline harm reduction workers. And this was aimed to improve the PrEP awareness and eventually uptake among female women who inject drugs. Another important part of this project was the fact that it allowed for the harm reduction workers to adapt their messaging according to the needs, interests, and priorities of the service users. And we can see that the evaluation that was done on the intervention showed that PrEP discussions among service users doubled. And I just want to point out that there are a few other studies that show that promising data on integrating PrEP in the harm reduction setting. So where do we move on from here? First and foremost, we need to implement multi-level actions to create environments that are favorable for the implementation uptake of PrEP and other prevention tools. This includes decriminalization of drug use, sex work, and addressing stigma around PrEP use. Implementation science will be key to developing strategies to facilitate PrEP uptake and retention, whether it's oral PrEP, injectable PrEP, or any other prevention tool. We should also be moving towards integration of PrEP into existing services where women are already present, feel comfortable, and not stigmatized. And we also need the adaptation of PrEP services to meet specific needs of women and explore ways of simplifying the access and medical follow-up of PrEP. Health professionals have a role, and they should be specifically targeted to both increase the awareness and knowledge of PrEP, as well as to improve their capacity to discuss with women who may identify with one or multiple stigmatized identities about their needs. And moving forward, community engagement is essential. Peer workers have continuously shown their ability to improve access to prevention and treatment for key populations. And peer workers can play a key role, for example, in PrEP programs in the first 3 months when we see that risk of poor adherence or loss to follow-up is quite high. And community engagement can also be important in the developing of PrEP messaging and services that better meet the needs of women. And I want to say, because I have to say it, we're talking about a diverse group of women with diverse needs, and we have to acknowledge that there are periods of sexuality, sex and inactivity, or sexual inactivity or activity, and that we have working with different contexts. So engagement in a prevention pathway, which does or does not include PrEP, provides an opportunity to provide a full range of prevention services or tools. And finally, just a word to not forget about other groups that are also less represented in the research. Research and development efforts should also be expanded. And I would just like to end by thanking my colleagues for the PrEP Femme project, as well as other people who have contributed to this presentation. And if you're interested in more in learning about the PrEP project, my colleague Amel will be presenting the presentations today, and there was a poster also regarding the data on Mauritius. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. This was very interesting, especially for me, because I am working at the AIDS hotline, so people can phone and answer. I've got a lot of questions from gay men about PrEP, but I have never got a question from a lady about this. So this was extremely interesting. So thank you very much. We have time for a question. Do we have a, yes, Lorraine?
Hi, I was quite fascinated and wondered if all the fieldwork could be obviated if you could just get Alastair to to write a program to inform you how these different groups might have such different needs, how you may adapt.
Is that a question or a comment? Yes, I don't know what to say. No, it would be interesting.
Oh, over there we have a hand up.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting presentation. I was just wondering, I know we didn't go through the barriers, but it seemed like quite a few of the barriers that were mentioned were very specific to the pill taking, like the daily pill taking. And I'm thinking, especially in the African context, what do you think injectable PrEP is going to do to that picture? If that question makes sense, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, yes, it does make sense. And it's something that we're thinking about. I think a lot of people are thinking about it. Personally, I think that it is promising, but we also have to consider, in my talk, I talk about, I didn't say it, but kind of a demedicalization of PrEP. And if we're looking at injectable PrEP, I don't think that we're in that direction, because at least for the CAB LA, you would still have to have someone come in every 2 months to get an injection. And I think we have to see, for example, for the female sex workers that we saw in Ivory Coast, if that would fit into their needs. So I think it's to be explored. We'll see.
Okay, thank you so much. This was a very good morning, wasn't it? And now the coffee is outside, we hope. So thank you so much.